Okay, so we are now recording. Thanks again for joining us today for our first BrEPS meeting of the week. Again, it will be recorded and available on our BrEPS website and in our social media as well. As it will be recorded, if we would all like to mute ourselves, that would be great, just so we don't get any interference throughout the recordings and throughout the presentations today. So I'll give everyone just a couple of minutes. If you'd like to just pop yourself on mute, that would be great. Thank you all. Okay, so today's session will be presented by Professor Lorraine Whitmarsh, who is Professor of Environmental Psychology at Bath, and Annayah, who is a final year PhD student as well. So they'll be giving us some great insights into presenting on taking your research outside of the lab. So that's today's session. We will be taking questions at the end of the session. Please feel free to just pop your hand up at the end, or you can use our chat function as well, and we can address those. And they've really generously said that they can give all the presentations to everybody at the end of the session as well. So you will be able to access those. Okay, I've got a few more people just entering the session. For those who have just entered, we are recording the session, so if you'd like to pop yourself on mute, and if you would like your camera turning off, that's fine. Okay, I'd like to hand over to today's presentation.
Yeah.
That's great, thank you. Right, thank you very much, and I'll hand over.
Thank you very much indeed, Lauren. It's lovely to be with you today. And hello to everybody else. Thanks for joining. I'm just going to share my screen. We've got some slides and then hopefully plenty of time to have some discussion after our talks. I think the first thing I would just emphasize is that while Annayah and myself will be talking about our experiences, we would really value hearing other people's experiences in terms of taking your research out of the lab. I think a lot of us in environmental psychology and sort of allied areas do this quite routinely, so would really welcome other people's experiences and views when it comes to the discussion. So we're not going to be presenting a kind of definitive view here, but just our take on things. So who are we? I'm a professor of environmental psychology, as you've heard, at the University of Bath, and also director of the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations, or CAST for short, which is it's a consortium of several universities and a charity, Climate Outreach, and we look at the role that people play in tackling climate change. So environmental psychology is one part of the work that we do. So there's sort of quite a strong behaviour change, communication focus to our work. And we work very closely with a lot of organisations outside of academia, as you'll hear. So that's really quite a key part of the work that we do. And I'm delighted that Annayah is joining me. Annayah is one of my PhD students, actually, but she is based at Bath. And Annayah, do you want to say a few words?
Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. Yeah, nice to see you. I'm Annayah. So I'm a final year PhD student in social, moral and environmental psychology. So a very broad PhD topic. I explore how people's identities link to their environmental behavior and whether holding pro-environmental identities like being a vegan is overall a good or a bad thing for societal change in general. And I find this topic of like taking your research outside of the lab absolutely fascinating, because I got my start in research in a moral psychology lab, which was literally like sitting down with participants doing stimulus tasks, and my work has changed a lot since then. So yeah, I'm delighted to talk about this with more today. So yeah, that's me.
Thanks, Annayah. And as you'll get a bit of a flavour of the sorts of things that we've been doing, but here are just some of the organisations that between us we've been working with over the past few years. So some of these are charities, for example, Climate Outreach. We also do work with Possible and other charities. Some of them are governmental organisations, so UK government departments, but also devolved like Scottish and Welsh government. Some are local authorities like Bath and North East Somerset, Cardiff Council, Cornwall Council and others. And some are other sorts of organisations, including some businesses as well. Annayah, anything to add or?
Yep, so Making Change Happen is a group of psychologists that I'm involved with who do kind of contract work with businesses about social identity. And then the Black Rock City Census to the right-hand side is actually a group of researchers who study people who attend Burning Man, the festival in America, and I'm also involved with them as well. So there's, and then we've also got was it the Climate Crisis Advisory Group, Lorraine, that you were involved with?
Yeah.
Which is a great initiative on YouTube. If no one's seen it, you should definitely check it out, because yeah, a lot of really great engagement with the public and wider research issues on that channel.
Great, thanks. So yeah, I'm happy to talk more about these specific examples in the discussion if you'd like to hear more. But I'm just going to talk for a few minutes really about, I guess, some of the general issues in terms of taking your research out of the lab. So I don't know if any of you saw this, but this was a bit of a live debate in the Journal of Environmental Psychology last year. Christian Nielsen and colleagues submitted a letter to the editor entitled "The Case for Impact-Focused Environmental Psychology." And it was a really well-argued piece saying that in environmental psychology, we don't focus enough on the things that matter, on the behaviours that really count. So impactful behaviours like flying or eating meat, etc., that there has historically been too much attention on less impactful behaviours, which might be easier to change, and on the mechanisms and interventions that maybe tend to be more effective at changing those lower impact behaviours. So they argued that we really need to refocus the whole discipline to be much more impactful and to actually revise our theories and our toolkit to have greater impact. We wrote, that is me and actually many colleagues led by Van Velkengoed in the Netherlands, a response saying, yes, we definitely agree, but we also need theory. And theory can enhance impact. So we engage in a bit of a debate about, is there a tension between doing rigorous and theoretically informed research versus research that has impact and actually addresses environmental problems in an urgent way? So I think there was just some interesting kind of discussion points that were made in the two papers. And they really highlight that actually it's not necessarily straightforward and unproblematic to do impact-oriented research or problem-oriented science. And that's some of that we're going to touch on, I think, some of these tensions, hopefully, in our talks. It can be just challenging to do for various reasons, like the timescales of science. Getting our science really rigorous and robust and published can be very slow compared to the timescales on which policy needs to happen and policymakers need insights. And there are lots of challenges, as we'll hear about, the sort of complexity of changing policy. But also there are sort of questions really about how objective can or should we be in a climate crisis? Do we actually, do we undermine our credibility as objective researchers if we advocate for a particular course of action? Conversely, we found in some of our work recently that climate scientists actually fly more than any other type of scientist. And we know from other research that that sort of behavior, not walking the talk, can undermine our credibility as scientists. So there are some interesting kind of things, I think, to reflect on the extent to which should we be seen as objective, neutral scientists? Is that a realistic thing we should be aiming for? Or given we have a climate crisis, should we be much more going outside the lab and trying to make a difference and advocating for particular things? Or is there a middle ground to be had? So we probably won't resolve all of that, but it would be great to have maybe some discussion around some of that. But as I mentioned, what we do in our centre, CAST, is really try to address the climate crisis. And critical to addressing the climate crisis is achieving radical societal transformation. We certainly need new technologies, but we really need widespread behavioural change to tackle climate change. This is made clear by analysis done by the Committee on Climate Change, where they have quantified what we need to get to net zero and show that a large proportion, over half, requires some behaviour change. Perhaps more starkly, analysis by the Hot or Cool Institute recently showed that in the UK, we need to reduce the average carbon footprint from 8.5 tonnes to 2.5 tonnes of carbon dioxide in the next 8 years, if we're to stay within 1.5 degrees warming. So a really radical change in people's lifestyles. In order to achieve that sort of transformation and those sorts of behaviour changes, we need to work across disciplines. No single academic discipline can solve something complex like climate change. So we need lots of insights from across not just the social sciences, but also engineering and other sciences. We shouldn't assume that always those insights will be complementary. Sometimes they will be, sometimes they might be quite divergent. And actually that where there might be contrasting or conflicting insights, actually that can in itself be quite creative. It can force you to reflect on maybe the limitations of your discipline and to come up with new ways of thinking and maybe come to create sort of step changes in understanding in some cases. Interdisciplinarity is not only important from that sort of more practical point of view, we need all these lots of insights to address a complex issue, but it can actually be quite rewarding in the sense that a lot of funding now does come through not just ESRC, a sort of traditional social science funder, but other funders like EPSRC, NERC, MRC, through interdisciplinary collaborations. So actually, it is possible to get funded in this more interdisciplinary mode of working now. But as we'll maybe touch on, there can be challenges in terms of working across disciplines. There might be very different paradigms, and sometimes we've had some interesting debates with sociologists about our very different worldviews, and sometimes we've managed to find a way through that and sometimes not. Different language, terminology, and different there can be challenges in terms of thinking about career trajectories, and maybe there might be some things that we can pick up in the discussion about this. So are there risks in terms of maybe straying too far from your sort of core discipline, if that's maybe psychology, into a sort of very interdisciplinary area, and maybe in terms of sort of getting a permanent academic career, if that is what you want to do, then does it risk that in some way? So there can be some sort of trade-offs, but ways also of navigating that, I think. But we're also interested not only in working across disciplines, interdisciplinarity, but also beyond disciplines, academic disciplines altogether, and working with societal stakeholders like businesses, communities, charities, and that's sometimes called trans-disciplinarity. And here, a lot of what we do, particularly in our centre, is we try to co-design research and actually co-design the delivery of interventions of evidence-based ways of changing behaviour within companies, within communities, and so on, in order to have a bigger impact. So the more we work with, for example, local authorities or companies, the more we can understand their particular context, their particular problem, work with the people within that environment to design very specific evidence-based interventions to try to reduce emissions, be more sustainable, etc., achieve well-being benefits, hopefully. And this is in line with the sort of the theoretical literature around science, so the sort of STS literature that sort of reflects on participatory models of science, sort of mode 2 science or post-normal science, lots of sort of theoretical frameworks that reflect this sort of getting out of the lab and doing more applied co-design type work and action research. And that's important, as I've mentioned, really, where we are talking about a complex and quite value-laden issue like climate change. It's important to bring very diverse forms of knowledge into that. So how can we get out of the lab? So in terms of initiating partnerships, there can be a number of sort of avenues to do that. if you're an early career researcher, maybe a PhD student or a postdoc, one sort of perhaps quite easy way to do this is to find somebody within your organization or within your center, within maybe even your research group, who is doing work with maybe with a local authority or a charity or somebody outside of the university, and try to get involved in that work and sort of, or at least express an interest and say, if you've got anything coming up, let me know. So just actually making yourself known to people who are doing this sort of work can then potentially provide you opportunities to work on some of those projects. So kind of make those alliances and get in there. There can be some very specific funding opportunities that enable you to do this sort of partnership working. One example is the recent ESRC Policy Fellowship Scheme, and that provides opportunities to work with UK or devolved government for up to 18 months to do sort of co-research and really be embedded within that policy environment, which is really valuable experience. But there are also little pots of funding like the Impact Acceleration Account, the Policy Support Fund from Research England, and other schemes which provide dedicated pots of money to actually do impactful research. And then again, it's, you know, you can identify a particular maybe applied problem and maybe a partner who might benefit from that work, and actually having some funding then focuses can provide a good focus for collaboration. So you can make direct approaches to organizations and say, there's a funding opportunity here, could we work together? And yeah, there are other sorts of placement schemes, policy fellowships. It's also worth doing events, and so just getting out there, doing talks to the public engagement, or offering to give talks to, you know, local authorities or other sorts of organizations who you think might be interested in the insights from your work. So volunteer to give a talk, and that will get you sort of known and might lead to further collaboration opportunities. And I guess related to that, disseminate your work widely and accessibly. Post it on social media, write blogs, briefings, do podcasts, because actually what we've found is that where people like big companies and policy groups have approach us, it's because they found our website, or they've read a blog, or they've seen something on social media that we've posted. It's often through those sorts of social media and online routes that people have come across our work and then get in touch with us. So get yourself out there in that in those spaces. So I guess related to that, public engagement, there's a lot that could be said about sort of how to do public engagement, lots of theory as well, and sort of empirical evidence about how to do it well. And broadly speaking, we can differentiate between disseminating your research to the public. So maybe you have some interesting findings and you want to share those, and maybe they have implications for different groups, versus dialogue, where maybe you're actually interested in the public feeding into your research in some way, maybe even identifying research questions that you could be focusing on that potentially address issues of importance to different groups in the public. So the sorts of tools available speak to sort of one or both of these. So we're sort of doing kind of TV, radio interviews, or doing blog posts or Twitter stuff. That is probably more likely to be about dissemination, with sort of relatively limited opportunities for dialogue. Similarly, if you're actually creating kind of tools, and we recently created a data portal which creates bespoke visualizations. You can kind of go in and play around with lots of these kind of things so that you can see what survey data in different countries and amongst different groups says about what people think about climate change. So those sorts of tools can be quite useful for different groups within the public. But again, that's sort of us getting our research out there. But the more we sort of go down this list, so events of various kinds, and there are lots of ones out there, like the British Association for the Advancement of Science. They do a Festival of Science. There's the ESRC Festival of Social Science. We've done stuff at the COP26, so we did a panel sessions, and lots of kind of interactive stuff, and people might also go out into more public spaces like museums. This is work by the Tyndall Centre to do climate change sort of exhibits in museums. That's starting to kind of maybe open up space for dialogue in terms of getting people to maybe feed back their ideas on the research that we're doing. And then there might be kind of ways in which to bring public views strategically into your work through, for example, something that we've been trying to set up for a while, and we're almost there, a youth panel to actually feed into our centre's research strategy and design. Tell us, what should we be researching that actually is important to you? That sort of, really much more strategic input. So there's lots of things that can be done around public engagement. A big part of what we do in our centre is trying to impact on policy, so climate policy, energy policy. And it's not easy. The challenges are really well documented. We know that it's not just about having a conversation with one policymaker or politician. There are political systems across different scales, from international down to sort of local level, and different kind of strands within that. It's difficult to influence when there's a whole sort of system and various networks. There's also politics at play, and that can be very difficult to sort of penetrate. So if you have some research findings that suggest that things have to change very radically, they may not be always very welcome. The timeframes on which science happens versus policy I've mentioned can be quite a challenge. Access to evidence. We have a lot of our research hidden behind paywalls, and that's starting to change, but getting our research to be free as well as more accessible in the form of, say, blogs or briefing papers is really critical. Now, I really want to just emphasize that there is an evidence base on how to get research into policy. So it's not just about kind of anecdote. Actually, there is good evidence. So there is a review paper by Kearney and Oliver from a couple of years ago that is a systematic review that highlights really the key things to do to maximize your chances of your research being impactful for policy. And I won't get into too much detail. The paper really is great. I can recommend it highly, and I can post a link in the chat. But doing great research is a fundamental thing. So this speaks to this potential trade-off of rigor versus impact. Actually, you've got to do good quality research. Otherwise, research users are not going to be interested. So they want to know that this is robust research in the first place. But then you've got to make it relevant and readable. So don't use jargon, use really accessible language, make it short, snappy, bring out the really key insights, like what does this mean for policymakers? So in our briefing papers, for example, on our website, we tried to just have really short papers, and then on the front cover, 2 or 3 bullet points that really just say, what are the key points that we're trying to make? Try to understand the policy process. So what are the ways into shaping policy? Maybe there's a select committee or some other sort of group of people that you could potentially be speaking to. Understand the difference between sort of the civil servants and officials on the one hand versus the politicians on the other, and that actually we need to probably be speaking to both, but they may be receptive to different extents at different times. Be accessible, and that's about actually trying to get in touch regularly, don't lose touch, use lots of different mechanisms to influence them. Decide if you want to be an issue advocate or an honest broker. And so this is really about, do you want to try to present yourself as being completely neutral, or do you want to actually say, we have a particular sort of key things we're trying to achieve here, and we have we're trying to sort of advocate for certain outcomes. There's not necessarily a right answer there, but I think it's good to be clear on your own position. Kind of linked to that, building relationships, but also the ground rules with policymakers. So be clear on how far you're willing to go and whether there is a sort of any boundaries that you are not willing to cross. Be entrepreneurial. So think of innovative ways that you can get yourself out there and engage with people and be an ambassador and actually champion your research. Or if you're uncomfortable doing that, find someone who is, go through the channels maybe in your organization where there are knowledge exchange experts or sort of comms people who can help you with that, and reflect continuously. How is it going? Are you enjoying this? What's working? What's not working? Underlying all of that, it's just worth drawing attention to the fact that no amount of perfect individual advice, like the perfect briefing paper by itself, is going to be enough, because policymakers, being human beings, are not rational decision makers. They use heuristics. So they're always looking for sort of shortcuts and trying to, as Kenny and Oliver put it, seeking computationally cheap ways to ignore almost all evidence in order to allow them to make choices decisively. So they really want like something that will help them resolve a particular issue. And part of that then is about framing. So this also relates to the fact that I mentioned policy, it's about policy systems and trying to sort of navigate that. And it's not just about one person making a decision. So that means we have to engage through multiple channels, try to build coalitions of people within that system that maybe supports the sorts of research outcomes we want, but really crucially, thinking about how to communicate in ways that might resonate more with the people we're speaking to, so, and thinking about the politics here, maybe behavior change isn't the way in which we want to frame our work. So this is a particular point I think is kind of coming to the fore in our work, and maybe more generally environmental psychology, is that particularly at the moment with the government that we have, there is a very explicit dislike of the idea of behavior change. It's very clear in the net zero strategy. If you read the forward there, it's all about technology will save us, and we are not requiring anybody to change their lifestyle whatsoever to achieve net zero. That's completely counter to the scientific evidence. However, if it is the case that the idea of behavior change causes sort of anxiety or some sort of it triggers people on the right of centre politically in some cases, or a subgroup of those people, can we reframe what we're talking about in the way that levelling up is a reframing of talking about equity and justice, actually, which is kind of interesting. So are there things that we can do to maybe focus attention more on say the business opportunities or job opportunities of the sorts of behavior change strategies that we're talking about, and focus, and rather than on the sort of the mechanisms that we're talking about, people actually changing, actually let's talk about those benefits that might appeal to our audience. I think we might also want to be thinking about the type of research we're doing, not only about reframing it, but actually we probably need to be doing more real-world intervention studies to actually show what works to deliver, in our case, emission reductions. And I think it's really important to do that more interdisciplinary working and to think in more systems ways, so that we do complement what we have in environmental psychology with what other disciplines can bring. And I'm now passing over to Annayah.
All right, thanks for that, Lorraine. Yeah, I think that was really interesting and comprehensive. So I won't go on too much, but we can talk about it more in the discussion. So for my part of this presentation, I wanted to talk about the kind of practicalities of engaging with people outside of academia from an early career perspective. So these are going to be kind of more practical examples. So if Lorraine set the theoretical stage, I'm going down into what it actually looks like on the ground. And to my mind, I think academics or people who are currently in academia can engage with people outside of academia in two main ways. And that's either as an outsider. So this is someone who's employed potentially as an academic or as a PhD student and is working with a policy or other kind of organization on a specific project, or as an insider, which is someone who is employed directly by the organization. And I know there's been a lot of talk recently on social media about academics kind of choosing to work in industry and leaving academia and stuff like that. And I think it's really relevant for environmental psychologists that so we can still have a massive impact on policy and behavior change outside of academia. So I wanted to mention that here. But as an insider, you could so you'd be directly employed by an organization, probably permanently full-time, to do a role like a policy researcher, research officer, or survey manager. So organizations that would employ people like this are maybe local and national government, or like other kind of organizations like Ipsos Mori, or different like opinion, different survey companies. And there's a lot of really interesting and important jobs available in this area. So if you are an environmental psychologist kind of wondering what you should do, I'd really recommend thinking about the breadth of anything that you can do and basically like trying everything out to see what sticks and what you like the most. But in terms of how you might initiate these two kinds of ways of working with people outside of academia. So as an outsider, like Lorraine said, you'd want to be thinking about a grant or a specific partnership, or if you're working as an independent research consultant, which is someone who is self-employed and then works for themselves, but then does work for other companies on a contract basis. You might get an invitation to tender, which is basically when an organization puts out an advert saying we need someone to research this, and then you apply to that specific advert. And as an insider, you probably go up for a job and be like go through a formal interview process. So Lorraine, if you could go to the next page, next slide, please. So today I'm going to talk about two of my experiences, specifically about working with policymakers, because I think this is a really important area for environmental psychologists. Just as a note, I've also worked with kind of business organizations, and I've also worked with kind of arts organizations, including festivals and theatre. So if you want some insights about that as well, we can talk about it at the end. But I've also actually worked as both an outsider and an insider on these projects. So I thought I would give you what my experiences were, how they differed, and yeah, why I think you should basically try out as much as possible. So Lorraine, next slide. So in terms of working as an outsider, so this was a project where I was I think a master's student or an early PhD student at the time. So I was working on a project called the Clean Air Zone Implementation Project with Bath and North East Somerset Council. And this project was basically because the council were introducing a clean air zone into the area, and they were really keen to find out how people were perceiving this policy introduction and how they could, how they could affect people and to make them more willing to actually adhere to the policy that was being introduced. So it was funded by Bath and North East Somerset Council. This was actually initiated in a really cool way. So one of our students, Annayah, was at a scholarship reception with the mayor of Bath and was talking to the mayor about the clean air zone and the kind of problems that people might have psychologically with it. And from that one conversation, the whole project spiraled out into this like huge thing. And we also did a lot of quantitative and qualitative work from this. So this project really just shows the power that one conversation can have. And Anna was an undergraduate at the time that she had that conversation as well. So don't underestimate your power to influence these kind of collaborations across all career levels. It's really important. So in terms of the duration of this, so this was a 9-month duration from the start of the project to having the reports done and presented back to the council. This was also the first time I kind of worked outside of academia, and everyone I worked with on the team was like, whoa, this is super fast, like this is breakneck speed, oh my goodness. And I think when you start like working with people outside of academia, like the time scale is a lot faster, as Lorraine says. I live on a main road, so there might be sirens going by in a minute. But so for example, one of my academic projects I started working on in 2016, and it might be getting published this year, hopefully. And that's kind of, you know, that's not uncommon for a lot of research projects. Whereas when you're working with policymakers, they are funding you to have kind of immediate impact on the problem that they have. So just bear in mind that these timescales are indeed very fast. Next slide, Lorraine. So I'm just going to go through some things that I kind of found out while working on this project, siren, were really important for working as an outsider. So these are just some kind of tips I have. The biggest thing, I think Lorraine mentioned it, is just managing expectations on both sides. So making sure you have an early conversation about what you are planning to do, how you are planning to do it, how quickly you can do it, and just kind of having that conversation throughout and informing your partner of any issues that you have or any delays or anything like that. Because I think one thing that is really important is communication, and I'll go on about this a little bit more later, but it's not necessarily like the organization that you work with aren't necessarily going to know how academics work, and you are not necessarily going to know how the organization work either. And there's a lot of kind of assumptions behind both of your experiences that you won't understand unless you kind of talk them out and manage those expectations throughout. Second point is kind of maintaining this positive relationship. It's particularly important when a project is kind of funded either fully or in part by an external organization, because the people that you're in touch with would also have to be in touch with their superiors and kind of demonstrate that the project is worthwhile. So it's really important to maintain a good personal relationship with the people you're working with. I would almost always suggest that it's really good to have regular team meetings with the organization that you're working with, maybe like once a month, once every 6 weeks, depending on the length of the project, just because it's very easy for things to get miscommunicated in email. And there's a lot of conversations that you end up having kind of in person or online that you might have had if you had less contact. So I think that communication is really important. Again, kind of clarifying this output and the timeline and making sure that any delays are actively communicated. There's also a point to be said here about recognizing the political and social context that you're doing your research in. So I actually did this project on the Clean Air Zone, and Boris called the snap election. And basically, when you're working with policymakers, what happens when there's an election is a lot of policymakers aren't allowed to engage in any activity that's seen as political. And a lot of the research we as environmental psychologists do, unfortunately, is kind of categorized as, you know, kind of political, particularly if you're on sort of Tory-leaning councils or areas, or potentially Tory-leaning areas. So we actually ended up losing contact with the council for a month during this period of purdah, which is where they're not allowed to do any political activity. So just keep in mind that there will be, when you're working with policymakers and government in particular, things like that, you can't often predict them and you can't control them. So just stay in contact about the timeline and make sure everything is reasonable for everyone. And yeah, ensure the project keeps to budget. So this depends like what kind of role you're playing, but it's always good to kind of keep tabs on, particularly if you're working casually, like I was, keeping tabs on your hours. If you are starting to go over your hours, like letting someone else on the team know. And because it might be like for the Clean Air Zone project, it was a lot more work than we expected. And we managed to get a funding increase to match the amount of work that we had to do. So yeah, just this kind of constant communication. So next slide, Lorraine. So then in terms of as an insider, so I did this project with the Clean Air Zone, and I was like, yeah, really psyched about it. And I really wanted to do more policy work in the future. And this was actually in 2020. So I started my PhD in 2019, and kind of about 6 months into my PhD, COVID hit. And because I was planning to do a lot of research on travel behaviors, as I'm sure a lot of the participants here were planning to do, I had to kind of rethink a lot of my PhD very quickly. And this was very overwhelming. And I was kind of thinking about potentially working as a policy researcher after my PhD. So I took a break and I decided to do a Southwest Doctoral Training Partnership funded me to do 3 months on placement with the Reset Initiative, which was part of the all-party parliamentary group on the Green New Deal. And this project was kind of looking at how the kind of moment of change that COVID created for people changed their environmental behaviors, and how we could take those changes forward and kind of pressure ministers to do that. So I did this placement. It was funded by a variety of sources. So my funding for my role was funded by my doctoral training partnership. Most doctoral training partnerships have some kind of funding available for people to do full-time placements with non-academics. So if you're interested, it's worth like seeking this out. But I think the project as a whole was kind of mashed together from a hodgepodge of different sources, which my line manager sorted out. So she had to be in really like close contact with all of these stakeholders over the course of the job. And we did a bunch of polling, focus groups, and policy reviews of the impact of COVID-19 on all areas of life. And this was a 3-month duration from me starting the project to having 2 50+ pages reports delivered. And it was with a much bigger team, but it was, again, a bit of a shock to the system as an academic used to projects lasting like years and years. So if you're in academia and you're thinking about whether you want to stay in academia, and one of the things about academia that frustrates you is how long things take and you'd rather they moved quicker, policy research might be a place for you. Also journalism as well. When I've worked with journalists, the timescale was a lot faster. So yeah, just kind of bear that in mind when you're working with these organizations. Next slide, Lorraine. So in terms of the priorities on this role, again, time to deliverables was huge. So we had a huge set of stakeholders. I had to do different presentations like most weeks. I also had a much clearer, I had to report to my superiors and these stakeholders much more often than I did as an academic, because as an academic, you get a bit more independence about what you do and when you do it. So again, if you're kind of thinking, one thing you don't like about academia is the lack of direction at times, I found certainly that policy research gave me a little bit more direction, so that might be a better career path for you. They were also much more concerned with media coverage. So once we did all of the research, we spent a lot of time kind of contacting journalists about the work, and also a lot of time kind of writing directly to ministers about the work to try and get it like on the table. So for them, the kind of impact was much more important. And similarly, again, we kind of had these pinch points of certain parts of the project where political events kind of happened and we had to work around them very quickly. And I think when you're working with policymakers, you just have to realize that there are going to be events that happen that are just completely out of your control, and you've just got to do the best you can with the time and resources you have, and it's okay. It doesn't have to be perfect. Next slide. Cool. So we're almost there. I think I've got a few minutes left. So I just kind of wanted to give everyone who's thinking of doing this kind of research a few questions that I think you should think about before you do the project. So the first question, one of the most important questions, is ultimately, do you want to do this? And it seems like a really silly question because you've engaged this project and you've probably planned out a lot of stuff. But really think about whether this is an enthusiastic yes for you. Because sometimes, you know, we can take on stuff for the prestige, we can take on stuff because we think it will look good on our like CVs or whatever. But when you're working, especially as an outsider, it can conflict with other things on your time. And saying yes to something will mean that you have to likely say no to another project. So really just take some time to think about the decision of whether you want to do it and make sure it's an enthusiastic yes, because if it's not, it's a no. Next one, Lorraine. Second question is, why are we doing this? So what is our main objective? And does that objective align with our partner? So it's a similar kind of conversation about what do we want as our output? And do our values align? Because it might be that you think that you're doing one kind of thing, but your partner thinks that you're doing something very different. So you need to have these conversations very early on. Next one. And yeah, so the next question is, what are the benefits to our partner and to the research team? So again, I think as an environmental psychologist, particularly as it is quite a politically charged area, you've got to be a little bit careful and make sure that the value to yourself is kind of even to the value to the people that you're working with. So it might be that you take a project on due to pay, it might be because you want to have a connection with this research group, but you also need to think about why your partner wants to work with you and kind of ask yourself if that matches up. Next one. And do you have the time to commit to this fully? I'm happy to chat a little bit more about this in the discussion if you want, but particularly if you are working with non-academic organizations, as someone who works full-time in academia, either as a PhD student or as an academic, we are very busy. You know, we have a lot of demands on our time. And I think it's really important to consider before you do a project, whether you have the time to commit to this fully and to do a really good job with the time that you have. And if you do have the time, how can you make sure that you protect your time that you have and not run over and not impede any of your other projects? So just as a really quick tip, I actually time all of my hours. I have an app like on my MacBook, which tells me how much time I've spent on every single project. And then I can really easily see each week how much time I'm spending on one thing and if I'm going over. And then I can kind of work out like, oh, if I've spent a lot of time on it this week, maybe I could take less time to do it next week. And just kind of keep track on how much time you're spending and just make sure like before you do a project that you really have enough time and you can protect that time and you can say, okay, well, if I'm going to work 10 hours a week, I'm going to block off an entire day to do this. or in whatever way works for you. Lorraine, next one. And yeah, this final point, it's very specific. So I think it's really important when you're working on a wider group to consider what will happen if you lose a team member. And especially when you're working with an organization, it might be that you have one clear contact with that organization, but there might be turnover. So someone might change jobs, and then suddenly if you've only got one contact, you may lose that contact. So I would really advise everyone to think ahead about what you might do if there are kind of changes in the team or changes in the organization to make sure that the project can happen regardless, and have those conversations ahead of time, because it's a really big shock when it happens and you haven't anticipated it. But if you can have that conversation at the beginning, then you already have a plan in place and it's much easier to deal with. Next one, Lorraine. Cool, some more key questions. These are very similar. So these are questions to ask your partner. So why do you want to work with us? What kind of expectations do you have of what we can achieve? What do you think our skills are? Because it might be that I think you have one skill and then you look at it and you're like, oh, actually, I can't analyze this data set at all, actually. So ask the question before you embark on the project. Do you have any expectations about the results of our work? So it might be that if you're working on some environmental work with, you know, for example, if you were to do a project with an organization like BP, they're probably not going to be too happy if you come out with something saying that oil is bad. So you need to think about what kind of results an organization might be expecting from you, and if that's in line with your academic values and your personal values. And if it's not in line with your personal values, don't do it. I would say it's not worth it. Also, do you want this work published in an academic journal? Because some organizations will be really up for that, and then that can be good because it has career benefits for you and also kind of reputational benefits to the organization. But it's really good to know before you do a project whether that's on the table or not, so that you can plan for it, and what will happen if we need to change the project in any way as well. Next one, Lorraine. Yeah, so I made this really big. I have this habit in my presentations of making my most important big point huge so that people remember it. I think if you take anything away from this presentation, remember that communication is key and make your assumptions explicit. So if you go to the next page, Lorraine, you can kind of think that you speak the same language as your partner. You might have some experience of policy and you might think you know what they're saying, but it's actually really important to kind of compare those translations throughout. So if you click it again, we'll see kind of some kind of differences. So for example, policymakers might prefer percentages over inferential statistics. They might prefer a report or briefing over a publication. They might prefer kind of practice over theory, as Lorraine was talking about, immediate impact over prolonged peer review. There's also a broader issue of intellectual property and open science, which I'm just trying to address in a paper that I'm writing. But it might be that if you want to publish the work in a journal that requires the data to be open, you need to discuss that with your organization, because some organizations will really not be okay with that because it infringes on their intellectual property. Also plain language over jargon, and also just consultation data is not often clean data. So just if you're doing a project that involves any kind of consultation data, this is usually with like local or national government, bear in mind that you will need to take a lot of time to clean that data to make it accessible for analysis, and policymakers won't always be aware of this. So bear in mind. And Lorraine, next one. I think we're almost there. Yeah, just another like further reading. So I actually wrote this article about the broader process of collaborating with others and why I think it's really important. So if you want to check that out, you can do that at the link. And I think that is all of my slides. Is it, Lorraine? Yeah. Cool. So I think we're just on time. Excellent.
Great. Thank you. So yeah, we have a bit of time for questions. I suggest if you want to ask a question, just please raise your hand. We'll also just keep an eye on the chat. I think maybe let's see if there's anything in there.